Dogman in the Outhouse. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I keep wondering why people don't tell stories about the Dogman in South Carolina. It makes me wonder if they've gone extinct here. I know that they at least used to live here, as I had a horrible experience with one of those boogers this one time when I was a young man. Back then, my grandfather used to live in an old house he supposedly built himself that was to the west of Wedgwood, inside the watery swamp. The only electricity he had came from his old gas-powered generator, and there was no plumbing at all. I'm not even sure he actually ever bought the land the house was built on. He just put it up in a swamp. Nobody was ever going to stake a claim on that land. Nobody else would have wanted to live there, even back then. The house wasn't one of those houses built on stilts over water. It was on real actual dirt and grass, although the wetlands and more dangerous areas were within walking distance in most directions surrounding. If you needed to go to the bathroom while visiting my grandpa, that meant a fun-filled trip to the outhouse. I didn't really enjoy going to the outhouse, although it wasn't quite as scary as the ones in cartoons and movies. Like, you didn't have to sit on a plank of wood. There was porcelain. And you could pump some well water, at least I hope it was well water, into the porcelain sink to wash yourself. But it was crawling with spiders. Call me nuts, but I am not a fan of spiders. So on this one day in particular that I'm about to tell you about, when I got to the outhouse, I was looking down as I opened the wooden door to the tiny shack in the backyard. I was very concerned about spiders on that day, to the point where it seemed like a real problem to me. I was about to be taught a lesson about what a real problem actually is. My downward glancing eyes did not immediately spy any arachnids down there, but I did see two very large hind paws of a very large canine, which made no sense at all because A, dogs don't use the outhouse, and B, if they did, their front paws would be in front of their hind paws. That's why they call them front paws, in fact. The claws on those paws were long, longer than I'd ever seen on any living creature before, and I discovered that the file cabinet in my mind could not make a match with any other creature I had encountered up to that date. I couldn't tell what kind of animal feet those were down there, but I didn't have much more time to contemplate the odd, large wolf paws because I was literally taken aback by the loudest sound I've ever heard emanating from a biological creature. In other words, whatever those back legs were connected to screamed at me. I mean, it was like a roar mixed with a bark, mixed with a shout, unlike anything I'd ever heard in nature before, and I literally fell over backward. No exaggeration. My back hit the dirt hard and knocked all the wind out of me. I found myself desperately and painfully trying to inhale some air back into my lungs as I looked up at the creepiest and most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. Even to this day, I can't tell you what that was that I was looking at. I mean, sure, these days we'd call it a dogman. So fine, I was looking up at a dogman, but what in tarnation is a dogman? Is it a kind of mutated bear? Is it some kind of hybrid between two species? If so, which two species? It mainly appeared to be some kind of canine, but it clearly wasn't an ordinary one of those now, was it? For one thing, its fur, although mainly gray, was tinged with green, especially at the ends. It was like his roots were coming in natural and he needed a new dye job on his green hair. For another, the creature seemed to have Spanish moss covering its head and shoulders, which hung down and blew in the breeze. For you northerners, Spanish moss is what we call this stuff that's neither Spanish nor moss. It curls around like little rubbery slinky toys hung from tree branches like Christmas ornaments. It grows naturally on trees, but I'd never seen it growing from or hanging off an animal before. So the big dog-like monster thing was standing up now, a step out of the outhouse, and he was still making a huge noise, just furiously expressing his anger and distaste for someone like me, so rude as to barge into the outhouse while he was still busy in there. He was bending over me and making a deafening racket, spit and drool flying everywhere as he did so. I couldn't do much except look up at this thing, all the way up there, and continue to wheeze and gasp and try to pull some oxygen into my poor lungs. The dogman stopped barking very, very suddenly and began smelling me all over instead. It suddenly dropped the anger completely and turned the sniffling and snuffling up to 11. It smelled me like it was the most important thing it had ever done. It smelled my face, my throat, my clothing, and then it settled on my crotch area to smell a little too long for my liking. Heck, he smelled for a lot too long for my liking. I didn't like the level of interest in that particularly sensitive part of my anatomy, and I tried to slide away from it across the dirt. That was when I heard my grandpa yelling at me from some place I couldn't see in that moment. He was shouting at me to hold still. "Hold still, boy! Do you want it to take a bite out of your underpants?" That was a rated G way to put it. Grandpa was good at that. No, I did not want to have the big hairy monster take a bite out of my underpants, or what was under those underpants. When the creature heard my grandfather bellowing at me, it withdrew a little, and by a little, I mean a few inches, and I looked over at where he must have been standing. The black dog lips pulled back, revealing teeth like I'd seen on the Tyrannosaurus Rex skull they have at the museum. In fact, that wolf head was the largest one I'd ever seen, and it did, at least in that moment, resemble a hairy mammalian version of the T-Rex. It had a long snout, huge oversized fangs capable of ripping and tearing, and it also was bigger than any canine skull I'd ever witnessed in my entire life. I felt like I was gonna faint, and I don't only mean from lack of oxygen. The black spots were crowding the edges of my field of vision, and I didn't think I had too long for this world. So Tyrannosaurus Wolf was growling and drooling, but his attention had shifted from me to my grandfather, and it soon was barking at the old man in its deafening way. I felt like I was caught between a married couple arguing in line at McDonald's. The beast would roar, and my grandfather would roar back, shouting insults and rude comments at the animal, seeming to be challenging it to come and get him. I wondered if these two had a prior history together, judging by the way they were bickering. But then, something Grandpa said really annoyed the giant, hairy, Spanish moss-covered monster man, and he stormed over toward my grandpa, walking over my chest in the process and instantly knocking the air out of my lungs once again. This time, I passed out. If you've ever been knocked out in a boxing match, this felt sort of like that. It wasn't like I fainted or like I fell asleep. It was like my body turned off and I was no longer conscious at all, period. When I started to come to, I was extremely confused. I was lying in the same spot, but I had no memory of why. I didn't even recognize where I was. I didn't remember who I was. And I didn't know I was in my grandpa's backyard, in front of his outhouse. I was completely confused as I sat up and looked around. If I was in front of an outhouse, I must have been heading there to use the bathroom. Using the wooden shack to lean on, I pulled myself back up to my feet, discovering that my head and chest were both aching pretty badly. I also felt dizzy, although that passed in some time. Opening the outhouse door, I was hit by a terrible odor, even worse than normal for a structure of that sort. Looking inside, my memories came back, and I knew I was in my grandpa's outhouse. But I didn't feel like I needed to go, so why was I there? Looking down at my pants told me that I had already gone, and I remembered suddenly why. I remembered the Dogman and how it had scared me, and I fell over backward. In my fear, I must have relieved myself right then and there. I remembered my grandpa shouting at the Dogman and the werewolf-like thing walking on my chest. Just thinking about it hurt my entire ribcage. That animal must have weighed as much as 3 men. I was lucky he hadn't crushed my heart and chest into mush. In fact, he had made a hairline fracture in my ribs in the front, but I wasn't to learn about that for some years afterward. It was around then I noticed it was starting to get dark out. How long had I been lying there? And why had my grandfather just left me there on the dirt instead of bringing me inside after the Dogman left? Where was my grandfather? Where were my parents? Nothing was making sense even after my memories had returned. Brushing myself off, I walked back to my grandpa's house to see where everyone was and to find out what had been going on. When I got there, I found a pretty horrific scene. Through one of the windows, I looked inside the house to see that big old giant dog-headed man inside there, and he had herded my family into the corner of one room like a sheepdog. I saw Grandpa's rifle was broken into pieces and the entire family was being held hostage as the Dogman ate what was going to be the family dinner that night. At this point, I could see its entire body at once for the first time, not just the feet or the shouting, barking Tyrannosaurus head. It stood so tall that it had to bend a bit at the shoulders and the neck just to fit in the room with my family. It really appeared to be a man to me in that moment, a giant, hairy or furry man with a tail like a raccoon sort of hanging down and covering its unclothed rear end. I was looking at it from the back, and I was seeing that Spanish moss hanging down like rock star hair over the whitest shoulders I'd ever seen on any humanoid ever. This guy could have made millions in the NFL, but he chose to take my family hostage instead. Well, we all make our own choices in life. I also saw for the first time that this creature had hands, like a human being. Well, obviously not exactly like a human being, as humans don't have 3-inch or longer claws, ending in sharp razor points at the ends of each of their fingers. The Dogman picked up the turkey I had been looking forward to eating with both its hands and ate the stuffing out of the middle as though it were devouring the innards of a fresh kill. I wondered what it would do after the food was all gone, and a chill went through me when I realized it might try to eat my family next, one by one. I ran to our car parked out front and prayed that my father had left the keys in the ignition so that I could drive off to get the sheriff. He had not. Grandpa did not have a telephone, and if he did, I wouldn't be safe going inside to use it anyway. If I tried to run inside and save my family, I would end up trapped the same way they had. After all, the creature had clearly disarmed my grandpa with no trouble at all, so what challenge would I be to it if I ran at it with a broomstick or a baseball bat? I had no other weapons in the vicinity that I could think of. The only thing that was in the neighborhood were train tracks, and somehow in my panic, I decided I would run there, stand on the tracks, make the train stop, then tell them what was happening. Maybe they could radio for help for my family. It was a crazy, somewhat nonsensical plan, but I was beyond desperate, and I was running out of time to save everyone. I ran through the woods toward Foxville Road because I knew that intersected the trackway at some point. I hit that road and I ran like I'd never run before, and then Like a miracle, along came the sheriff and his deputy in their police car. He turned his siren on for just a second to signal that he wanted me to come over to him, but he didn't need to worry about that. He was the man I most wanted to see in all the world. As I approached, he began lecturing me and quizzing me about what I was doing, running around like a maniac alone at night, etc., etc. I was panting and gasping for air, and each time I tried to say anything, he would interrupt and go back to his hectoring. Eventually, his deputy was like, "Hey, I think he's trying to tell us something." It was like a scene in an old episode of Lassie, with me as Lassie. I pointed at the deputy and shook my head yes, still having trouble catching my breath to speak. "Is it trouble at your grandpa's house, boy?" I shook my head yes, like Lassie would have. "Can you lead us to the trouble, boy?" I climbed in the back of the patrol car, and I told him that a big, dog-headed booger man had taken over my grandpa's house, and I was afraid he was going to eat my family alive. I can't imagine telling that to a police officer in current year, but even back then I got a few chuckles in return. They said they ought to give me a breathalyzer test to make sure I wasn't drunk, but I assured them I was not, and that they should call in backup because this monster was huge. I told them it had disarmed my grandpa, and that quieted them down. They radioed in about where they were going and asked for another car to be sent to the same location. When we finally arrived, the sheriff parked in front of Grandpa's house and took out his megaphone. He told whoever was inside to come out with his hands over his head, as though he were dealing with an ordinary fugitive. When he got no response, the sheriff calmly began to repeat his entire message from the top in a bored and leisurely fashion. The door burst open so suddenly and so unexpectedly that both officers and myself screamed and ducked behind the patrol car. It's a good thing we did, too, because through that door came that truly immense dog-headed hairy swamp booger, and he was charging directly at us. Those canine legs propelled the huge mass of living fear faster than the fastest Olympic runner, and I felt like I was going to get trampled to death along with two of the finest officers in the state of South Carolina. I saw my life flash in front of me just like it happens in the movies, but all within the space of like 1 second or two. I saw my childhood. I remembered things from when I was a baby that I never remembered before. It was like my brain was reviewing all the files in its computer storage unit before flushing them and preparing to shut down for good and permanent. I had one experience like that later on in the Marines. It's not a fun thing to go through, either for your spirit or your body. That Dogman was running toward us, and with him came the end of everything, both the good times and the bad. As the Dogman drew closer to us, I wondered what he was gonna do, and I wondered if my family had already been done in by him. As the creature got about 8 feet in front of the parked police cruiser, he leaped up over our heads in a superhuman jump, landing once on the rooftop of the police vehicle, then bouncing off it and landing in the darkness beyond where the light from the house could reach. We heard it running off into the swamp in the darkness, and neither officer displayed any inclination to follow. I ran inside to find my family shaken up, but not hurt, and we all hugged and had a bit of a reunion. After going over the story with the cops, the whole lot of us drove into town to get ourselves dinner at a restaurant which was owned by friendly people that we knew. The sheriff and his deputy joined us, and we talked for what seemed like hours about the Dogman. What was it? Had anyone heard of this thing being in the area before? And stuff like that. The next day, a bunch of families gathered at Grandpa's house. Back then, the division of labor was simple. Women and children helped fix up the damage inside Grandpa's home, while the men gathered into a large search posse patrolling the woods looking for the giant wolfman with the intention of doing him in. The women and kids were successful, but The men came home drunk and surly, unable to track down the beast. People urged Grandpa to get out of that swamp, telling him it would never be safe, especially for an old man living alone. But the Dogman never came back, and Grandpa lived out the rest of his days in relative peace. For the rest of the times I visited him, I took a long stick with me. This way I could tap on the outhouse door from a safe distance to make sure there wasn't another Dogman in the outhouse. About Robin May, I've got something to say. We'd be sobbin' if not for Robin. Please join us in thanking Robin May for making this episode possible. In exchange, Robin gets to see our secret uncensored stories far too wild to ever run on this channel. She also gets to see our 21 hours of archived secret stories and a weekly sneak preview as well. And so can you. Just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com or click that join button under each and every one of our videos and become a Scary Stories channel member. And now, here's international TV spokespuppy Henry Lee Dogman with the rest of the deets. Hank? Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com. And that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.